And if you wouldn't mind turning with me this morning to 2 Corinthians chapter 8, please. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. If anybody needs a Bible, got a couple gentlemen here that are love to hand you one. Just shoot your hand up and love to have you follow along. Been making our way verse by verse here through 2 Corinthians, and just to remind ourselves a little bit of why this letter was written. There's a couple reasons, and Paul spent a great deal of time talking about just the characteristics of ministry, what ministry looked like. And we've mentioned before that 2 Corinthians is almost a manual for ministry. If you want to know what service for the Lord should look like, come to 2 Corinthians. There's a lot here to learn. And he also wanted to know where they were at with him. He's had to do some correcting. They were in error in a couple different areas, and he had to correct that. And so he wanted to know, was their relationship going to survive this correction that he had to give them? And in chapters 6 and 7 that we're just coming out of, Paul said he desired that in chapter 7, verse 2, that the Corinthians would be open to him, that they would open up their hearts, just like he said in chapter 6, verses 11, 12, and 13. He says, our mouths are open to you, our hearts are open to you, and we want that to be reciprocated. We want you to be open with us as well, to have these enlarged, open hearts towards us. And as we read towards the end of chapter 7 there, Titus had now returned back and gave him the report that they weren't holding a grudge, that they were open to him. Their hearts, it was reciprocated. Their hearts were open to him. And so he wanted this open mouth, open hearts. But now, perhaps, is the greatest reason that Paul wrote 2 Corinthians. Now, it took him this long, really, to get to what is probably the heart of the matter. And the reason that this entire letter was written is that he not only wanted their mouths and the communication to be open and their heart to be open, he wanted their hands to be open. And he's going to talk about giving. He wants to talk to them about finances. And the original church in Jerusalem, just kind of to set some context, was in need. And the Corinthians had committed to giving aid financially. This is all backstory here. And Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, that we're going to make this collection from the churches, the Gentile churches, and we're going to send it on to the church in Jerusalem. But they've been kind of dragging their feet. Maybe it's because they were a little upset with Paul, that he had to do some correcting. But now, as we're going to read, at least a year has passed. And because they had originally volunteered to participate in this, he feels like he's at liberty to talk to them and gives them the instruction and some encouragement about financial stewardship. And so he's going to spend the next 2 complete chapters talking about our finances, our stewardship with those, and how we deal with those. And because Paul spends chapters 8 and 9 completely talking about finances, what we're going to do is we're going to break that up into a 24-week series. No, I'm just joking. We're going to treat this like we would any other passage. And it's going to take us 2 or 3 weeks to get through here. And we don't talk about your pocketbooks or finances or checkbooks or anything like that unless it comes up in the text we're studying. And if you're new with us today, this just happens to be where we are. We happen to be in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. And no, I didn't plan this. I thought it was ironic that in between Black Friday and Cyber Monday, we're going to talk about how to spend your money. But for some of us, and I get this, I just want you to know right off the bat, for some of us, even already, I brought up finances, I brought up money. Some of us are on edge about that. That sends up a red flag for us because it almost can seem like it's borderline unscriptural. Like, can't we just stick to the love and hope and peace and sunshine and rainbows and all of that? And why are you talking about something that affects my life a little too close to home? Or maybe and this is what can happen to me, maybe it's because we have been almost inundated with greedy name it and claim it preachers and televangelists on TV that are constantly manipulating us and misrepresenting God in the process about how they need our finances. All of this just causes us to want to sometimes avoid talking about the subject of finances. Now, even though there is a lot of abuses out there, there is a lot. That's reality. A biblical discussion about money and our finances and about each one of your bank accounts is not unscriptural, and it's not unspiritual. And I believe the Lord wants us to have an understanding about finances. He wants us to have a godly direction for our finances, just like He would any other area in our life. And it would seem almost in particular this area of our lives. I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Bible doesn't shy away from talking about money. I don't like to talk about it, but there's over 2,000 verses that deal with money and wealth and possessions. You could classify 1/3 of the parables have a reference to finances and use of money. 15% of what Jesus said was about money. And so I think when we have an understanding about the Word says about money, the decisions that we make with our finances, it can actually reveal a lot to us. And we're going to see, Paul says, it's a tester about where we're at, and it can reveal what we value and what's important to us and where our priorities are. Now's a good time to silence your phone. Scheffers, okay. It's my family, so I can call them out by name. But now, there's a few reasons here. This church in Jerusalem, as I said, needed some finance. There's a few reasons for that. And we're just going to spend, because we've got 2 chapters here, I am going to spend a little bit of background here. But there's a few reasons why the church, the Christian church in Jerusalem, needed some help. They needed this aid. First of all, if you take notes, it's because of heavy persecution. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10, He said, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set man against his father, a daughter against mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be those of his own household." This is what was happening, as Paul writes this, in Jerusalem. By the time that he pens what we call 2 Corinthians, this letter to the church in Corinth, the church in Jerusalem has celebrated their 20th anniversary. They've been for 20 years now following Jesus Christ. And for 20 years, the situation, if you remember in Acts, right after the church starts, Peter, James, and John, they're in prison. They're thrown in jail. They're persecuted. This has only increased for 20 years. Those who had accepted Jesus, the 3,000, and then another 4,000. And it was a big church, but all these people that have accepted Jesus were persecuted by the establishment. They were arrested. They were terrorized. They were ostracized in a very real way that we can't quite grasp here in Western culture. But families were divided over this. Jesus, you're gonna accept this guy as the Messiah? I want nothing to do with you. And when it came to the market, I'm not going to buy and sell with a heretic like you. I'll take my business somewhere else. And all of this created an incredible burden on this 20-year-old church now in Jerusalem. The second reason that the church in Jerusalem was in a tight spot was because of famine. And again, if you remember in Acts chapter 11, there was a prophet by the name of Agabus who predicted, and history confirms, that there would be a great famines throughout the empire during the reign of Caesar Claudius. And that's exactly what happened. And especially hard hit was this area of Judea. They were hit the hardest in all of this, and that was only 5-6 years before Paul writes this letter, and they're still recovering from that. You just don't get over a famine of that magnitude that quickly. And so that was one of the reasons, persecution, famine. And third, it's very possible they ran out of resources. Again, I take you back to Acts chapter 2, and if you remember, when the church first began, it says there in Acts 2, like in 46, 47, right in through there, that they liquidated all of their real property and possessions to help support themselves, and almost like this communal type of living. And it's very possible that now, 20 years later, those resources have dried up. They've sold the property. They've sold this. They can't buy. They can't sell. Their family's ostracizing them. They're in a tight spot. And so this is kind of the situation headed into chapter 8 to give us the background of what Paul is addressing. So just to recap there, we have this poor group of Christians in Jerusalem. We have this group of believers in Corinth that promise to help out. Paul's trying to facilitate that and make sure that the finances get from the Gentile churches in Corinth over to Jerusalem. And then we're going to see that Titus is kind of the messenger back and forth between Paul and Corinth. Now, what's very interesting is that in these next two chapters, this is so fascinating to me, that even though these chapters are entirely about finances, it's not something peripheral, that is the main point. The word money is not used in these two chapters. Many different words are used. Riches, support, abundance, contribution, all of these. But the most common word that's used in these two chapters, 10 different times it's used, is the word gift or grace. It's the same word in the Greek, and it's translated one way or another based on kind of how the sentence is set up, but it's used 10 times. And I don't think that this is an accident, because the Lord could have put money in these spots, and it would have made sense. But I think the Lord kind of wants us to redeem the way that we think about finances and all of that. Instead of thinking of it as money, as something that we use to buy and sell, He wants us, I believe, to think of it as grace. It's something received and given. Big difference between buying and selling and giving and receiving. And so the whole way through here, it's referred to as grace. It's grace. And so I've entitled this message, The Grace of Giving. And the first instruction that Paul has, number one, by way of example, Paul teaches us that giving gracefully is a proper response to God's grace. Look at verse 1. Moreover, brethren, we make it known to you the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia. And I think we have a map here, only on one, okay. There's a map here, and you can see there's Jerusalem down there. Ephesus is where he's writing from, Corinth, and then Macedonia is that whole area it's really everything north of Corinth. That whole area is Macedonia. And you can see that it includes Thessalonica, Philippi, Berea, if you're familiar with the book of Acts, is in that area. It's also the same area that Alexander the Great, he's the son of Philip of Macedon. He's from that exact same area. He grew up like 25 miles from Thessaloniki. All of that is in that area right there. And he says, these churches have experienced God's grace, but they've had that bestowed on them. But there's been some troubles. Verse 2 says that in great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. This whole sentence is a paradox. These guys are a paradox. They don't fit in with how we think things should go. They had grace and abundant joy, but they also had affliction and poverty. It's a paradox. They're also a paradox in the sense that we tend to assume, even though sometimes we've probably all heard the statistics, we tend to assume that the more abundant giving comes from wealthier sources. But what Paul's going to do is he's going to reason with this church in Corinth that if this poor church that's afflicted, they're dirt poor, and really the idea is like scraping the bottom of the bucket. If they can give so liberally and abundantly, what can you guys do in Corinth? You've got some padding in your wallet. What are you guys going to do if the churches in Macedonia can respond like this? He says in verse 3, for I bear witness that according to their ability, yes, and beyond their ability, they were freely willing. Every time I read that, I want to say free willy. But freely willing. These churches from Macedonia are a great example, and Paul's using them for that, as an example to Corinth, but also as an example to us. And so kind of the next point here, the next sub-point here is they teach us, first of all, that anyone can abound in giving. Every person in this room can abound in giving. Some of us have been to foreign countries, poor countries, Haiti, Mexico. Anyone can abound in giving, because abundant giving isn't so much about the amount of dollars that you give, it's more about the attitude you have when you give the dollars. And so Paul acknowledges here that they gave to their ability. There wasn't much. There wasn't a lot of ability, but they gave according to it. And then, even beyond that, they were abundant in their giving, and because they gave sacrificially. And Jesus praises this kind of giving. I even feel uncomfortable even saying this because I don't want to come across as like the televangelist, but this is reality. Jesus praises sacrificial giving. Giving that pinches a little bit in the wallet. You'll remember in Luke 21 that Jesus saw how they were giving in the temple, and he saw all the rich, wealthy people dumping their gifts into the treasury. And then afterwards, after they came through with all the fanfare and all that, a poor widow comes, and she dropped 2 mites in. It's less than a penny. It's just, there's nothing. And Jesus said, as he's watching how they give, he says, truly, I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all. Not like more than that person, that person, that person. What he's saying is more than all of that combined. That couple pennies. And he goes on and says, for all these, the wealthy, gave out of their abundance. They put in offerings for God. But she, out of her poverty, put in all the livelihood she had. She gave pennies. But it was so abundant that Jesus said it was more than the rest combined. This is opposite. This is the paradox. Because the world sees what is given. Jesus looks at how it is given. The world looks at the amount that you give. Jesus looks at the motive for why you're giving. The widow's mite, the Macedonian offering, it didn't come from excess. She wasn't wealthy, the Macedonians weren't wealthy, but it was abundant because it was sacrificial. Second thing that we can learn here from the Macedonians is that they gave voluntarily. They gave freely. They gave freely, willingly. This comes from a compound word. It's one word in the Greek. It's self-choice. But notice that's such a huge thing today, this freely willing. That's so uncommon, unfortunately, to even have this attitude in churches. Because Paul doesn't say to Titus, I'm sending you back there, kind of check on this collection. And as soon as you get back to Corinth, here, look at this. Here's what I've made. And he didn't unravel this huge thermometer, right? That I want you to put this on the wall, Titus, so that they know how much to give. I want you to promise them that we're going to engrave their names on the stones. Or Titus, tell them that if they reach this dollar amount, they can have this handkerchief that I prayed for over myself. Would you tell them that, Titus? Paul didn't have to use these worldly, carnal methods to raise money for God. They gave, he says, more than their ability, but it was voluntary. And it was what they chose with no pressure. He says in verse 4, check this out. They were imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift, and again, that word is grace, and the fellowship, that word, koinonia, some of us know that word, the gift, the grace, and the koinonia of the ministering to the saints. The Macedonians, they gave abundantly, above and beyond, sacrificially. They gave freely. They gave voluntarily. Third, they gave enthusiastically. In fact, Paul says they were pleading with us to take their money. Can you just picture that in a church setting? Begging and urging, can we please have the opportunity? You ever see something like that on TV or something, or just like, I have to have that? The ShamWow, the Flex Tape, the Thigh Master, the Clap-On. Maybe that's what's up with the TV right now. It's like the Baby Yoda doll. It's like, shut up and take my money, right? You're just like, I have to have that. That's how the Macedonians are responding when they understand here's an opportunity for us to participate in ministry. Here's a way for us to bless those people. Take my money. I want to be involved in this. And this, again, this is the opposite of how so many churches and ministries operate today. These big televised fundraisers and events, there's certain points in the service at just the right time after they've made a connection with the people. They have what's referred to quite simply as the ask. It's that simple. That's the moment the speaker has made his case. He's connected with them, and now he's going to plead with them. And this, my friends, this is how you can help. This is how you can get involved and keep this ministry on the air. The Lord needs you. Would you take out your wallet right now? Every single one of you. I know that the Lord's just pulling on your heartstrings right now. Pull out your checkbook. And I know that there's 100 people that want to give $1,000. I've been practicing. No, I'm just joking. It is gross. That's unfortunately, which is far more common today. That's not what's happening here. Paul says, I didn't have to beg them. They begged us with urgency. Let us participate in the ministry. Please don't take away our opportunity to have a blessing by giving. This was the reverse ask. And again, literally, here's our gift. Here's our grace. Now, I want to draw your attention real quick back to verse 1. Notice, God was gracious. God bestowed grace on them. Verse 1. This is what we do with that grace. This is the natural response to receiving grace. It's to extend that grace then to others. Please let us participate in this ministry. This is how we, way over in Macedonia, can have a part in the lives, can have fellowship, koinonia, this togetherness, this partnership with the saints in Jerusalem. Giving lets us, church, participate in ministries beyond our sphere of influence. Now, we get in little old Calvary Chapel, Ellensburg here, we get the opportunity to support some local missions here in Ellensburg and in the county. We also get the opportunity to support missionaries in Mexico. We support 3 missionaries in India. And we get to participate in this. We get to be a part of that fellowship, that blessing, and we get to be part of what's going on in Uganda at the church there. A lot of us have been to the church plant there. We've helped pour the cement for the floor. Yeah, that's that. We've helped put the walls up. We send the pastor through Bible college. All of that is very Macedonian of us. We get to participate in what God is doing on the other side of the planet. It's amazing. And so this abundant sacrificial giving, this voluntary, enthusiastic giving, it all starts with recognizing that we've received grace. We've had grace bestowed upon us, and we're living in response to that. Then look at verse 5. And not only as we had hoped, but they first gave themselves to the Lord, and then to us by the will of God. What made the Macedonians' giving noteworthy was by the time they took out their checkbooks, they had already given the most valuable resource they had. They gave themselves completely to the Lord. They surrendered their lives to the Lord before they ever even opened up their wallet. Guys, that's how he rolls. That's what he wants more than anything. He doesn't need your money. And if he doesn't have you, he doesn't want anything from you. Okay? God wants you. Why would he want your money and not you? He's God. He's not after the money. But if we give ourselves to God, if we surrender our lives to him, the giving of our time, the giving of our talents, and the giving of our treasure is just going to come naturally. Because it's all yours already. I've already surrendered everything to you. And the Macedonians, in their poverty, even though they didn't have much, they abounded in this. We've already given our lives to you. And so they gave themselves to the Lord. Then, he says, they gave themselves to us by the will of God. This is what the Lord had called them to do. And giving is an act of worship. It's our giving back to the Lord, and it starts with surrender. It starts with surrendering ourselves. And these are the ones who had given themselves to the Lord. They don't have to be manipulated. They don't have to be coerced. None of that. They're giving abundantly. They're looking for opportunities to bless because I've already given everything of mine to the Lord. I've given who I am. Now, the Macedonians gave that way. The Corinthians, on the other hand, they were missing that opportunity. The Macedonians grabbed hold of that opportunity. The Corinthians, they were letting this opportunity slip away. Verse 6. So we urge Titus that as he began, so he would also complete this grace, this gift, in you as well. Titus had brought the report of how you were doing, and now he's bringing this letter. He's going to be the one carrying 2 Corinthians back, but he's there so that he can complete what was already began about this whole giving and collection thing. And we're urging him, Paul says, to see this through so that you can complete what you started. Verse 7. But as you abound in everything, check this out. As you abound in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in all diligence, and all your love for us, see that you abound in this grace also. Paul is not manipulating them. They had the ability, and they had pledged to give. Those are the facts going into it. But now, when the rubber is hitting the road, he wants to know if the willingness, if there's going to be some follow-through, if their ability is going to meet their willingness. Now, Jesus had said, it's more blessed to give than receive. Again, he's not manipulating. He wants them to trust the Lord in this. He wants us to trust the Lord in this area. He wants them to experience the blessing of giving. And so, for point number 1 was giving gracefully is a proper response to God's grace. Number 2, giving gracefully is very much a part of a Christian's walk. Sometimes we make the mistake as believers of thinking, I serve in the ministry, therefore that makes up and I don't need to give to the ministry. Or we can also think, I give to the ministry, therefore I don't have to serve in the ministry. Both of those are imbalanced. Both of those are out of whack. And sometimes we think that, well, these things that he's talking about here, faith, speech, knowledge, all that, we think those are the things that really matter when it comes to the walk of a Christian. Paul reminds them that's not all that matters. He says, I want to encourage you with this. You do well in these areas, and they're important. Faith, speech, knowledge, diligence, love. You do really well. But right now, you're out of balance. There's something missing from your walk, and I want you to excel in this area too. I don't want you to say that I do these 5 things, so I don't have to give. Just like I don't want you to say you give, so you don't have to work on these 5 things. Both are important. He says, I'm going to give you an opportunity to involve yourself in this grace. Here's an opportunity, not in the spiritual gifts, but the material gifts. Verse 8, he adds, though, I speak not by commandment, but I am testing the sincerity of your love by the diligence of others. Again, he's just reiterating that I'm not manipulating you. I'm not commanding you. I'm not obliging you or taxing you, but I am testing you. Are you going to put your money where your mouth was? That's what I want to know. Are you going to do what you said you were going to do? You're dragging your feet. You're procrastinating. And so, are you a little less willing because I had to correct you, or are you going to follow through on this? Again, you're doing great in these other areas, but how are you doing in this very practical thing? Is your bank account reflective of God's grace in your life, just like these other things might be? And so, he reminds them this is part of the Christian walk, this grace of giving. It says it tests your sincerity. Number 1, giving gracefully is a proper response to God's grace. Number 2, giving gracefully is part of the Christian's walk. Number 3, giving gracefully is following the example of Jesus. Verse 9. That's a great memory verse. If some of you guys are looking for memory verses. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that through his poverty, that you through his poverty might become rich. It's one thing to look at the example of the Macedonians, and there's things that we can learn from the Macedonians, but there's no better example of what graceful giving looks like than when you look at Jesus. The Macedonians were poor, but they gave like they were rich. Jesus was rich, and he gave it all up. Now, this is the fifth time, for you know the grace. This is the fifth time that word charis shows up. It's charis in the Greek. And again, sometimes it's translated gift, sometimes it's translated grace. The translators look at the sentence structure and try to decide which one they think portrays the best idea. But what Paul is saying, he says, you know the giving of our Lord Jesus. You know what he gave for you. Though he existed as God, all things were created by him and for him. Yet, even though he was that, he became poor. He became destitute. Jesus said, foxes have holes and birds have nests, but I, the Son of Man, have nowhere to lay my head. I became that. He became poor, Paul says, for your sakes. He became like us. He became poor so that we can become rich, so we can share in Jesus' heavenly wealth. Now, these two chapters are about giving. But what I want us to just notice real quick before we move on, that Paul's not just giving a speech about our responsibility and our opportunity to participate in ministry and finances. It is that. But this is theology. This is Christology. This is the nature of who God is. This is the nature of Jesus. Giving is at the heart of who our God is. And giving, grace, all of that, charis, it always says more about the giver than the receiver. And our God, Jesus, is the ultimate giver. And so when we're giving to voluntarily, sacrificially, enthusiastically, we're following the example of Christ. This is the example of Jesus. And this is the example that Paul wants us to follow. Again, I take your mind back to Philippians chapter 2, one of these churches in Macedonia, this area that excelled and abounded this way. Paul said this about following the example of Jesus in Philippians 2. He says, let this mind be in you. This isn't going to happen to you. You have to let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God. It wasn't something he had to take. I have to take that title. It was his. But he made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men, of you and I. And being found in an appearance as a man, he humbled himself, even as a man, and became obedient to the point of death, even the death on a cross. And Paul is encouraging now, just like he encouraged the Philippians in Philippians chapter 2, he's encouraging the Corinthians, follow the example of Jesus. Humble yourself, the greatest giver. Verse 10, number 4, giving gracefully should begin thoughtfully and continue faithfully. Paul says, in this I give advice. Again, this isn't a command. Here's the advice. It's to your advantage not only to be doing what you began and were desiring to do a year ago. You had this godly desire. It started in you a year ago. Okay? But now some time's obviously passed. You've been procrastinating. Well, the cure for procrastination is the second word of verse 11. But now you must complete the doing of it. That's my advice to you. You started off good. Now you got to finish what you started. That he says there was a readiness to desire it, so there also may be a completion out of what you have. For if there's is first a willing mind, it is accepted according to what one has and not according to what he does not have. He says you had the desire to do it, but the desiring to do it and actually doing it is two different things, right? That's one of the problems we can fall into as believers. We can hear a sermon, a message, read something and think, I agree with that. That is true. But that's not doing it. And he says, you had that start, and it was a good start, but you got to follow through. You got to, again, let your willingness meet your ability, and there's no better time than right now to put this commitment into practice. You have it right now. Don't worry about what you don't have. You have it. Let's follow through on this. You began this thoughtfully, now finish it faithfully. Number 5, giving gracefully is something we should all participate in. Verse 13. I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but by an equality, that now at this time your abundance may supply their lack, that their abundance also may supply your lack, that there may be an equality. The Corinthians were not encouraged to give, so the Macedonians could okay, man, we've really given a lot here. That wasn't the reason. The Corinthians were encouraged to follow through and give so that the believers in Jerusalem could just fine, we don't have to get jobs now. We can take it easy. But this was a way, he said, to express the love and the grace of Jesus to believers who have a genuine, real need. Now, this isn't communism. It's not socialism. This isn't an authority forcing shared goods and services, but it is reciprocal. There is a back and forthness to it. It's voluntary with the understanding, and this isn't a popular message, if we're going to be honest, for the American church sometimes. But he says this is a voluntary thing, that it shouldn't be believers living in excess while there's also believers living when they're lacking the basic needs in life. He says that's not right. There might be a time where you have to pour into them, but there also might be a time where they need to pour into you. And then in verse 15, he quotes Exodus 16 as an illustration. He says, as it is written, he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. This is a reference to collecting manna in the wilderness, and no one hoarded. If you remember in Exodus 16, you remember if someone tried to stow away extra, they stowed away more than they needed. What happened? It says it bred worms and it stunk. And God thinks it stinks when we hang on and we hoard our money when there's others that are lacking. Like I said before, this isn't a popular message for a capitalist American group of believers. I heard one commentator say, I've been in the church for 40 years. I've never heard these verses really taught about what it says. And again, it's not forced. The church isn't going to force you. The government shouldn't force you. But it should be voluntary when you have excess and another believer is lacking. It says everyone gathered, some gathered more, some gathered less, but they all share in what was gathered. Now we're going to stop there. As we go through chapters 8 and 9, what we're going to see, and I'm going to keep reminding you of, is that God is not broke. He's not trying to raise money. He's trying to raise kids. He's trying to raise mature believers. And he wants us, again, more than what's in your wallet, more than what's in your checkbook. Do we have instruction about giving? Is it an important test for our sincerity and all that? Yeah, that's true. But he wants us more than any of that. If you remember, I love the passage in Matthew 22. They're trying to trap Jesus, and get him in the horns of a dilemma. And they ask Jesus if they should pay taxes to Rome. And he says, brilliantly, he says, show me a coin. They bring him a coin. He says, whose image is on that coin? Whose image is on it? Caesar's. He says, give to Caesar what's Caesar. It's his image. Give it to him. But give to God what belongs to God. And the implication couldn't be clearer. You bear the image of God. You belong to him. Give yourself to him. That's what he's really after. And all that other stuff is going to work itself out. The finances. That's not the focus. The main thing, we have 2 chapters here with instruction that's good and profitable. But if we give ourselves, like the Macedonians it said did, if we give ourselves completely to him, all of that other stuff is going to work itself out. Amen? Let's pray.